The phone jolted General Peterson awake. 3 a.m. Never a good sign. Peterson here. Sir, we have multiple situations. NORAD reports unknown aircraft entering Canadian airspace. They're jamming radar, but it looks big. Really big. Scrambled, sir. But they're reporting markings. American flags. American? Are you sure? Positive, sir. Reports from Southcom. Heavily armed convoys heading towards the canal. They're flying the Stars and Stripes too, sir. This wasn't an exercise. This was real. A massive U.S. naval force. They're engaging the Danish Coast Guard. The unthinkable had become reality. God help us all, he whispered. The news hit the airwaves like a bomb. Across Canada, from the bustling streets of Toronto to the serene coastal towns of Nova Scotia, disbelief gave way to a chilling fear. Never in their wildest nightmares did Canadians imagine their neighbors to the south, their allies, their friends, would turn on them. Families huddled around radios and televisions, their faces etched with worry and confusion. Memories of war games and hypothetical invasion scenarios, long dismissed as the stuff of fiction, suddenly felt all too real. The familiar sight of American tourists, once a symbol of shared culture and camaraderie, now carried an unsettling undercurrent of suspicion. The Canadian government, caught completely off guard, scrambled to respond. Prime Minister Trudeau, his face etched with a mixture of anger and bewilderment, addressed the nation. His words were measured, but his tone was firm. This was an act of unprovoked aggression, a betrayal of trust that would have lasting consequences. Panama City, a vibrant hub of international trade, was thrown into chaos. The sight of American troops rolling through the streets, their heavy weaponry a stark reminder of America's past interventions in the region, sent shockwaves through the city. The Panama Canal, a marvel of engineering and a vital artery of global commerce, was now a flashpoint in a conflict no one saw coming. Memories of the 1989 U.S. invasion, a dark chapter in Panama's history, resurfaced, casting a long shadow over the present. The international community, already reeling from the attacks on Canada and Greenland, struggled to comprehend the audacity of this latest move. The canal, a symbol of international cooperation and the free flow of goods, had become a pawn in a dangerous game of power. Latin American nations, long wary of U.S. influence in the region, watched with a mixture of apprehension and anger. The Organization of American States convened an emergency meeting, their condemnations of the invasion swift and unanimous. The icy plains of Greenland, typically a realm of scientific research and breathtaking natural beauty, were now a theater of war. Danish Coast Guard vessels, hopelessly outmatched by the sheer firepower of the U.S. Navy, fought valiantly but in vain. The Arctic, once considered a region of international cooperation, was now a potential battleground. The world watched in disbelief as this remote island, known for its glaciers and polar bears, became the unlikely epicenter of global tensions. The strategic importance of Greenland, with its proximity to key shipping lanes and potential mineral resources, was undeniable. The Arctic Council, an intergovernmental forum for Arctic nations, was thrown into disarray. Russia, China, and other nations with Arctic interests expressed their alarm at the escalating situation. The delicate balance of power in the Arctic, carefully maintained for decades, was shattered. Section 5. Canal Chaos. Global markets went into freefall. The price of oil skyrocketed as word spread of the Panama Canal's closure. Shipping lanes were disrupted, vital goods were stranded, and the intricate web of global trade ground to a halt. The economic repercussions were felt worldwide. The United Nations Security Council convened for an emergency session. Accusations flew, tensions flared, and the world held its breath. The veto power wielded by the United States, once a tool of diplomacy, now seemed like an insurmountable obstacle to any hope of a peaceful resolution. Section 1. Northern Echoes. The news of the American invasion spread like wildfire across Canada, igniting a firestorm of emotions. Fear, disbelief, and anger coursed through the nation. Yet beneath the fear, a steely resolve took hold. This was not Canada's first dance with conflict. The echoes of past struggles resonated through the nation. From Vimy Ridge to Normandy, Canadians had fought and bled. They had stood shoulder to shoulder, defending freedom. Now the two nations found themselves on opposite sides. The notion of American tanks crossing the border seemed like a dystopian nightmare. Yet the nightmare was real, a stark reminder of shattered bonds. As the shock subsided, a grim determination settled over the nation. Canadians prepared to defend their homes and way of life. The spirit of 1812 was rekindled, a beacon of defiance. Section 2. A Troubled History. The Panama Canal, a testament to human ingenuity, has a turbulent history marked by ambition and conflict. From French failures under Ferdinand de Lesseps to U.S. completion under Theodore Roosevelt, the canal's story is one of perseverance. Disease, landslides, and political maneuvering shaped its creation. Completed in 1914, the canal forever altered the geopolitical landscape. Section 3. The Gateway's Guardians. The United States, acutely aware of the canal's strategic importance, had guarded it jealously for over a century. The Panama Canal Zone, a bastion of American power in the heart of Latin America, had been a source of both pride and resentment. During World War II, the canal served as a vital lifeline for the Allied war effort, facilitating the movement of troops, supplies, and warships between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Its defense, entrusted to a formidable array of military installations and thousands of U.S. troops, was considered paramount. The Cold War cast a long shadow over the canal. Panama, caught in the crosshairs of superpower rivalry, became a battleground for hearts and minds. The U.S., determined to prevent the spread of communism in the region, poured resources into propping up friendly regimes and countering leftist insurgencies. The 1989 U.S. invasion of Panama, launched to oust the dictator Manuel Noriega, remained a deeply contentious event. While the U.S. justified its actions as necessary to protect American lives and interests, many in Latin America viewed it as a blatant act of imperialism. Frozen ambitions. Greenland, the world's largest island, lay shrouded in ice and mystery, a land of stark beauty and unforgiving extremes. Its strategic importance, long overshadowed by its remoteness, had become increasingly apparent in the 21st century. The Arctic, once considered a frozen wasteland, was rapidly transforming into a region of geopolitical competition. Climate change, melting ice caps, and the opening of new shipping routes had awakened long-dormant ambitions. The United States, along with other Arctic nations, recognized the potential economic and strategic significance of this transformation. The Arctic's vast reserves of oil, natural gas, and minerals, once locked beneath layers of ice, were becoming increasingly accessible. Greenland, with its strategic location astride key shipping lanes and its proximity to North America, held a unique allure for U.S. policymakers. The Trump administration's interest in purchasing Greenland from Denmark, though widely ridiculed at the time, reflected a growing awareness of the Arctic's strategic importance. Section 5. The Price of Paradise. The Panama Canal, a lifeline of global trade, had become a choke point. The sudden closure of the waterway sent shockwaves through the global economy, disrupting supply chains and threatening to plunge the world into chaos. Ships laden with goods from Asia, destined for ports in Europe and the Americas, were stranded at either end of the canal. The cost of delays mounted with each passing hour, threatening to cripple businesses and send prices soaring. The impact was felt most acutely in the energy markets. Oil tankers, carrying millions of barrels of crude oil, were unable to transit the canal, sending oil prices skyrocketing. The global economy, already teetering on the brink of recession, threatened to plunge into a full-blown crisis. The closure of the Panama Canal served as a stark reminder of the interconnectedness of the global economy and the fragility of the systems that underpinned it. It was a wake-up call, a stark demonstration of how quickly a regional conflict could escalate into a global crisis. The invasion of Canada, a scenario once relegated to the realm of late-night talk show jokes and Tom Clancy novels, had become a terrifying reality. The speed and ferocity of the American assault caught the Canadian military off guard. Their defenses, geared more towards peacekeeping and disaster relief, were woefully inadequate to repel a full-scale invasion by their southern neighbor. The vastness of Canada, often touted as a strategic advantage, now proved to be a double-edged sword. The sheer distances involved made it nearly impossible to establish a cohesive defensive line, allowing American forces to advance along multiple fronts, exploiting weaknesses in the thinly spread Canadian forces. The air war was over almost before it began. The Royal Canadian Air Force, outnumbered and outmatched by the technologically superior U.S. Air Force, fought valiantly but was quickly overwhelmed. Canadian skies, once a symbol of peace and tranquility, were now filled with the roar of American fighter jets and the ominous drone of bomber formations. Major Canadian cities, caught in the crosshairs of the American war machine, braced for the worst. Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, once bustling hubs of commerce and culture, were now ghost towns, their streets deserted, their citizens huddled in fear as the rumble of approaching tanks echoed through the urban canyons. The Panama Canal, a glittering prize in the eyes of American strategists for over a century, proved to be a more troublesome conquest than anticipated. While the initial seizure of the canal itself was swift, securing the surrounding jungle and neutralizing pockets of Panamanian resistance proved to be a costly and protracted affair. The dense jungles and mountainous terrain of Panama, once obstacles overcome through engineering marvels and sheer willpower, now became a nightmare for American troops. Guerrilla fighters, intimately familiar with the land, waged a relentless campaign of hit-and-run attacks, targeting supply lines, ambushing patrols, and melting back into the shadows before reinforcements could arrive. The ghost of Manuel Noriega, the deposed Panamanian dictator, seemed to haunt the American war effort. Noriega, once a U.S. ally, had become a bitter enemy, and his knowledge of the canal's defenses and the region's intricate web of loyalties proved invaluable to the resistance. The international condemnation of the invasion, swift and unanimous, further complicated the American position. The Organization of American States, OAS, once a forum for cooperation and dialogue, became a platform for denouncing American aggression. Sanctions imposed by a coalition of outraged nations began to bite, further isolating the United States on the world stage. The invasion of Greenland, met with a mixture of disbelief and outrage by the international community, exposed the folly of American ambitions in the Arctic. The Danish military, tasked with defending the world's largest island, was hopelessly outmatched, their resistance more symbolic than strategic. The capture of Greenland, however, proved to be a Pyrrhic victory. The harsh Arctic environment, with its long winters, treacherous ice flows, and unpredictable weather patterns, posed a logistical nightmare for the American military. The very act of maintaining a military presence in such a remote and unforgiving environment proved to be a drain on resources and manpower. Supply lines, stretched thin across thousands of miles of icy ocean, were vulnerable to attack, while the constant threat of blizzards and sub-zero temperatures tested the limits of human endurance. The strategic value of Greenland, touted by American hawks as a gateway to Arctic riches and a bulwark against Russian and Chinese ambitions, proved to be more illusory than real. The vast mineral wealth, locked beneath layers of permafrost, remained tantalizingly out of reach, while the presence of American troops only served to further militarize the region, escalating tensions with Russia and China. The Chinese government, watching the unfolding chaos in the Western Hemisphere with a mixture of alarm and opportunity, found itself in an unenviable position. The United States, once a strategic competitor, had seemingly descended into madness, its actions threatening to upend the global order. The economic fallout from the American invasions was felt acutely in China. The closure of the Panama Canal, a vital artery for Chinese trade, sent shockwaves through the Chinese economy, disrupting supply chains and threatening to derail years of economic growth. The strategic implications of American aggression were even more concerning. The United States, bogged down in multiple conflicts, appeared increasingly unstable and unpredictable. The possibility of a desperate America lashing out at its rivals, perhaps even resorting to nuclear weapons, could not be discounted. China, walking a tightrope between condemnation and pragmatism, found itself thrust into a leadership vacuum on the world stage. The United Nations, paralyzed by American intransigence, seemed powerless to act, while Europe, deeply divided and reliant on American security guarantees, struggled to formulate a coherent response. Russia, long wary of American intentions, watched the chaos with a mixture of apprehension and grim satisfaction. The American invasions handed Russia a strategic opportunity. The Arctic, once a region of cooperation, was now a potential flashpoint. The American presence in Greenland raised the specter of a new Cold War. The Russian military, emboldened by American blunders, stepped up its activities in the Arctic. Submarines armed with nuclear missiles patrolled beneath the ice caps, while long-range bombers conducted simulated attack runs. The collapse of American credibility emboldened Russian proxies and allies. From Eastern Europe to the Middle East, Russian influence expanded, filling the vacuum left by a retreating United States. The American public, bombarded with propaganda, remained deeply divided over the invasions. The initial wave of patriotic fervor began to wane as the true cost of the adventures became apparent. Coffins draped in the stars and stripes arriving at Dover Air Force Base told a different story than the one peddled by the government. The casualty lists, growing longer each day, served as a stark reminder of the human cost. Economic sanctions, imposed by outraged nations, began to bite, driving up prices and eroding the American standard of living. The American dream seemed to be crumbling from within. The social fabric of American society, already frayed, began to unravel. Protests spread like wildfire across the nation, fueled by anger and a growing sense of betrayal. The consequences of the American invasions reverberated globally, shattering alliances and igniting conflicts. The global economy, already reeling from trade disruptions, teetered on the brink of collapse. The intricate web of interdependence unraveled at an alarming rate. The international system, built on rules and institutions, lay in ruins. The United Nations, paralyzed by American vetoes, proved inadequate to address the crisis. The world, teetering on chaos, watched as the American experiment descended into darkness. The American century had come to an abrupt end. The global order was in disarray. The world watched in stunned silence as images of American troops, raising the stars and stripes over Canadian Parliament, the Panama Canal, and a Greenlandic village, flashed across screens. The unthinkable had happened. The United States, built on ideals of freedom, had become a rogue state. The repercussions were immediate and far-reaching. Financial markets went into a tailspin. The Dow Jones plummeted, wiping out trillions in value. The Canadian dollar crashed, sending the Canadian economy into freefall. Global trade, already strained, ground to a halt. World leaders responded with disbelief and condemnation. Emergency meetings were convened at the United Nations and NATO. The language was harsh, the tone unprecedented. Never before had a UN Security Council member faced such widespread condemnation. Social media exploded with outrage, fear, and dark humor. #America first became a hashtag of international infamy. Memes mocking the situation went viral, providing a brief respite from the grim reality. The world was in shock. The United Nations Security Council became a stage for international outrage. Ambassadors lined up to condemn the American invasions. Resolution after resolution called for a ceasefire, withdrawal of American forces, and sanctions. Each resolution met a swift veto from the United States. The world witnessed the limitations of the international system. NATO found itself in uncharted territory. Never before had one of its members invaded another. Article 5 of the NATO treaty was invoked, but not in defense of the invaded nations. The United States declared itself under attack, turning the alliance on its head. The world was in turmoil. The European Union, long a close ally of the United States, found itself torn. The invasion of Greenland, a Danish territory, struck a sensitive chord. Germany, France, and the UK struggled to formulate a coherent response. Economic sanctions against the US carried the risk of triggering a global recession. Military action was unthinkable. Smaller European nations, particularly those bordering Russia, watched with fear. The American security umbrella now seemed like a cruel joke. The Baltic states felt particularly vulnerable. The invasion of Canada sent shockwaves through the former British Empire. Canada, long seen as a bridge between the US and the world, had become a casualty of American aggression. Vladimir Putin, watching the chaos from the Kremlin, allowed himself a rare smile. The American president had played his hand perfectly, albeit not as intended. The United States, bogged down in conflicts, was a shadow of its former self. The Arctic was now ripe for the taking. The American presence in Greenland was more of a nuisance than a threat. Russian troops conducted military exercises, testing NATO's resolve. Eastern Europe became even more volatile. The Baltic states pleaded for NATO reinforcements. The ghost of the Soviet Union had returned to haunt Europe. In the Middle East, the Syrian government, backed by Russian air power, launched a new offensive. The American withdrawal from the region now seemed inevitable. China, watching the American implosion, adopted a cautious but calculated approach. The economic fallout was felt acutely in China, but it also presented a chance to reshape the global order. The Belt and Road Initiative gained new momentum. With the U.S. retreating, China was well positioned to fill the void. The South China Sea became a testing ground for Chinese assertiveness. Chinese warships conducted patrols near disputed islands. The Chinese yuan began to challenge the U.S. dollar's dominance. Nations looked to China as a more stable economic partner. The American invasions elicited a nuanced response from the global South. Many nations saw a double standard at play. Where was the outrage when the U.S. invaded Iraq or Afghanistan? The African Union called for a peaceful resolution, urging dialogue over sanctions. The non-aligned movement emphasized the need for a multipolar world order. Latin America watched with apprehension and a sense of vindication. The invasion of Panama fueled anti-American sentiment. The global South found its voice, challenging the existing world order. The invasions presented an opportunity to advocate for a more just and equitable system. The world, in the aftermath of the American invasions, found itself at a crossroads. The old order, built on American power, lay in ruins. A new era of uncertainty and instability was dawning. The international system struggled to cope with the new reality. The United Nations seemed powerless to prevent further conflict. NATO was deeply divided, its future uncertain. The global economy teetered on the brink of collapse. The interconnectedness of the globalized world now seemed like a recipe for disaster. The American experiment had become a cautionary tale. The world held its breath, bracing for a new era of conflict and uncertainty. The initial shockwaves of the invasions had subsided, replaced by a chilling new reality. The United States, once the champion of free trade, was now a pariah state. The walls were closing in, not just geographically, but economically and diplomatically. Sanctions began to bite. Access to international banking systems was severed, crippling American businesses. The value of the US dollar plummeted, sending inflation soaring. The flow of goods and services slowed to a trickle. Supermarkets had bare shelves. Gas stations ran dry. The American consumer was confronted with scarcity. The propaganda machine struggled to maintain the narrative. Images of civilian casualties told a story of brutality and unnecessary suffering. The social fabric of American society began to unravel. The invasions ignited a firestorm of dissent, turning peaceful protests into violent riots. Cities across the United States became battlegrounds. Anti-war protesters clashed with police and National Guard units. Armed militias roamed the streets. The federal government responded with a heavy hand. Martial law was declared in several states. The Constitution was relegated to a relic. The American dream had become a nightmare. The land of opportunity had descended into chaos. The world watched as the United States descended into a spiral of self-destruction. It was a scene familiar from history, the fall of an empire from within. The parallels were stark. The Roman Empire had succumbed to overexpansion and internal strife. The British Empire had been dismantled by nationalism and self-determination. The United States had failed to heed the lessons of history. It had mistaken military might for true power. It had sown the seeds of its own destruction. The world now confronted a dangerous vacuum. The institutions that had governed international relations lay in ruins. A new world order, more chaotic and unpredictable, was emerging. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 had brought an end to the Cold War, but it had not ushered in an era of universal peace and prosperity. The ideological battle between communism and capitalism had been replaced by a more complex and multifaceted struggle for power and influence. The American invasions had inadvertently breathed new life into old rivalries. Russia, emboldened by American weakness and eager to reclaim its lost superpower status, flexed its muscles in Eastern Europe, the Middle East, and the Arctic. China, quietly but confidently expanding its economic and military reach, saw an opportunity to reshape the global order in its own image. A new Iron Curtain, drawn not along ideological lines but along geopolitical fault lines, began to descend across the world. The United States, isolated and reeling from self-inflicted wounds, was no longer in a position to dictate the terms of engagement. The world was dividing into spheres of influence, with regional powers vying for dominance. The dream of a unipolar world, championed by American policymakers after the fall of the Soviet Union, had proven to be an illusion. The world was returning to a more familiar state of affairs, one characterized by great power competition, shifting alliances, and the ever-present threat of conflict. The American people, once proud of their nation's role as a beacon of democracy and freedom, now grappled with the consequences of their leaders' folly. The invasions, sold to the public as swift and decisive actions to restore American greatness, had achieved the opposite, leaving the United States isolated, weakened, and deeply divided. The economic sanctions, initially dismissed as a minor inconvenience, had crippled the American economy, driving up unemployment, inflation, and social unrest. The once mighty U.S. military, bogged down in multiple quagmires, was stretched thin, its reputation tarnished by allegations of war crimes and human rights abuses. The moral standing of the United States, already damaged by years of foreign interventions and support for authoritarian regimes, lay in tatters. The invasions had exposed the hypocrisy at the heart of American foreign policy, the gap between its lofty rhetoric and its actions on the world stage. The American dream, once a symbol of hope and opportunity, had become a cruel joke for millions of Americans struggling to make ends meet, their lives upended by economic hardship, social unrest, and the ever-present threat of violence. The price of hubris, it turned out, was steep indeed. The international system, strained by populism, nationalism, and climate change, struggled with the void left by the implosion of the United States. Institutions governing international relations seemed incapable of addressing a rapidly changing world. The United Nations was reduced to a forum for empty rhetoric. The World Trade Organization was sidelined as nations retreated behind protectionist barriers. The International Monetary Fund seemed powerless to prevent a new Great Depression. The world, adrift in uncertainty, looked for new anchors and stability. Some turned to regional powers for protection. Others embraced nationalism, retreating behind borders. Some pinned hopes on transnational movements and non-state actors. The world, no longer beholden to a single superpower, entered a new era of fluidity and uncertainty. The future, once predictable, was now unwritten, a blank page for the coming years. The echoes of the American implosion reverberated across the globe, a stark reminder of the impermanence of power, the fragility of peace, and the interconnectedness of human destiny. The world, forever changed by the events of those tumultuous years, struggled to come to terms with the new reality. The lessons of the American tragedy were hard-learned, but ultimately invaluable. Hubris, unchecked ambition, and a disregard for the rule of law were a recipe for disaster, not just for nations, but for individuals and civilizations. The pursuit of power, divorced from principles and a commitment to the common good, was a road to ruin. The world, in the aftermath of the American implosion, had a choice. It could succumb to the forces of division, fear, and self-interest, repeating the mistakes of the past. Or it could choose a different path, one based on cooperation, empathy, and a shared commitment to building a more just and sustainable future. The echoes of the past, while a stark warning, could also serve as a guide. The future, though uncertain, was not predetermined. It was a canvas on which humanity, armed with the lessons of history and the indomitable spirit of hope, could paint a new masterpiece, one worthy of the sacrifices of those who had come before and the dreams of those yet to be born. The premise of a U.S. invasion of Canada, Greenland, and Panama seems ludicrous. It's a scenario from a poorly written political thriller, fueled by conspiracy theories. Yet it reveals truths about global power, isolationism, and the fragility of the international order. The United States, despite its might, is not immune to chaos and self-destruction. The allure of empire can lead powerful nations astray. Unchecked self-interest can transform a beacon of hope into a pariah state. The crumbling facade of American power serves as a stark warning. No nation, no matter how powerful, is above the law. The interconnectedness of the globalized world means actions have far-reaching consequences. The world after this hypothetical crisis is more uncertain and dangerous. The old order, built on American hegemony, lies in ruins. The future is now a blank slate where cooperation and conflict will wage a new struggle. Amidst the wreckage, a glimmer of hope emerges. The absurdity serves as a wake-up call, reminding us of sanity, diplomacy, and the common good. The international community can forge a new path based on mutual respect and peace. The United Nations can be revitalized for dialogue and conflict resolution. International law can be reaffirmed and strengthened. The American people have a role in this new world order. Isolationism and division must be confronted and defeated. Tolerance, inclusivity, and the common good must be reclaimed. The future, though uncertain, holds hope. This crisis reminds us of the stakes, responsible leadership, and human resilience. The fate of the world rests on our choices for a just, peaceful, and sustainable future. Please like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel for upcoming hot content.